So good afternoon, everyone. The topic of this presentation is going to be discussing how we were able to achieve the continuous manufacture of the real-time release for these small molecule APIs on a novel reactor system. So the agenda for the presentation, I'll start with going through. We'll introduce the use case, which is a novel reactor with modern goals. We'll then discuss the available QBD strategies to achieve what we're trying to do. And we'll talk about how we integrated Quartic, a modern data and analytics platform, and the QBD capabilities that we've been able to achieve. And then I'll present the results. So let's look at this, the use case. So it's a novel reactor with modern goals. The system, it's a continuous reactor, and it leverages microfluidics principles to achieve precise control of reaction kinetics. In terms of control, we can control temperature, pressure, and flow rate. The reactor has 2 inlet ports and 1 outlet port, and it is available in multiple scales, so ranging from bench all the way to commercial. The great advantage being that there's a 1-to-1 correlation in operating parameters. So anything learned during the design, the process design period, will be directly translated to that commercial manufacturing scale. And we've got integrated NIR for real-time product characterization. Now the objectives, so we want to use this novel reactor for manufacturing a range of APIs. So what we have to do is find recipes to manufacture and meet the QTPP for each of these. We want to leverage inline monitoring and the inline NIR and advanced control to achieve real-time release. Obviously, we have to maximize the performance of the system because it needs to be competitive with regards to existing methods of manufacturing APIs. And add a challenge to that, we have no historical information on this. It's a novel reactor, so it's not like we can draw from other systems to know what the recipes for these APIs are going to be. So the question is, can we leverage QBD strategies? Well, let's look at what aspects of QBD we would require for this particular project. So first of all, we need process design and performance methodologies. So as I mentioned, we need to find the recipe for many APIs. We have no operating history. We have to do this search efficiently. We also have to achieve efficient operation to be able to compete with existing processes. Next, we need to consider process controls. We want to be able to respond to process upsets, and that leads into the previous bullet where we want to be efficient. So if we know that there's going to be variability, we want to be able to respond to that. We need a solid process understanding. So we don't have significant time to train experts. We can't spend years people acquiring experience by working with this process. And we also need to transition knowledge between process life cycles. So I mentioned bench all the way to commercial scale and geographic regions. So the design, this process design may take place in one area, but the reactor may be shipped to many locations to the commercial scale to manufacture these APIs. So somehow we have to achieve equal understanding at all those different locations. And finally, we want to achieve continuous improvements. We want to be learning from our day-to-day variability, and we want to achieve process-centric rather than business-centric optimization. So what we see in a lot of cases with legacy processes is continuous improvement. It takes a top-down approach with business metrics like improving throughput, reducing variability. We want to do this from a bottom-up approach, really understanding the process and the product first and making improvements that will either improve either of those. So let's look at what strategies we have available. With regards to process design, performance, and understanding, the current methodologies are to perform a statistical DOE, to gain tribal knowledge over years of working on a process, and a lot of this information is stored in logbooks and reports. Now, the limitations, so with regards to building a statistical DOE, we assume that there's some existing SME knowledge. So, even if you're developing typically a new process, there is, for example, a MAB process. There is carryover from other MAB processes. You can draw on all that information. Now, with that experience comes also bias and variable selection, which is somewhat necessary because you can't test every variable in a DOE. You're going to hit its exponential growth with regards to the number of variables and the number of experiments. So you really do have to be somewhat selective. Unfortunately, sometimes that bias means that you're not exploring variables that may have an impact or a benefit to performance. With the way that the results of all of this are stored, logbooks, reports, SOPs, there's limited transfer across process lifecycle and across personnel. So, as I mentioned, you really need that time to develop these experts. And finally, all of this really leads to a qualitative understanding of CPP CQA interactions. We don't have that quantification, which means that later on we won't be able to take control actions when there is variability, when we do have fluctuations in inputs and material attributes and so on. Now, the other aspects of QBD that I mentioned we want to leverage, or that we need solutions for, process controls and continuous improvement. Right now, the current practice for process control really is inflexible SOPs. So there isn't really no method of adapting. We design our process around a single set point, and even if we know that inputs have slight variation, we allow slight variation, but we don't adapt to that slight variation. And when a combination of your inputs results in some excessive output variability, you're going to have an investigation or a report. And obviously, this is driven by what happened upstream with regards to process design, understanding, and performance. We'd have that qualitative understanding, as I mentioned, not a quantitative understanding. And as I mentioned earlier on, continuous improvement is often limited to business KPIs. So we don't have the know-how to drive this from a bottom-up improvement. We end up pursuing generic goals like maximizing throughput and variability. We engage non-technical departments like Lean Six Sigma teams. And often this may just end up in findings leading to an update to an SOP. So with regards to the objectives that we have for this novel system, they can't be satisfied with the available strategies that I've outlined. We need a modern approach, and we need to leverage Industry 4.0 data systems and advanced analytics. So that's where the Quartic platform comes into play. So you can see here I've got the same system, but what I've done now is we've deployed the Quartic platform, which is an industrial modern data analytics, data consumption and analytics platform. So I've deployed that platform, and so we integrate Quartic. Second step is we build models between the inputs and outputs of this process. So the inputs being those control parameters, the output being the characteristics, the CQAs, which are measured using that NIR probe. We then continuously feed and update this model. So every batch, every iteration, every set point that is run, the data is continuously being collected, and any variability is used to update this model, which is built on the inputs and outputs of the process. So as we do that, we're learning the control space, how those inputs affect those outputs. And finally, what we do after that is we layer a risk-based optimization for set point recommendation. So on top of that model of the control space, we use an optimization algorithm to recommend the best set points, and we actually have the capability to write those back directly to the control system, which can be pushed to the reactor. So really we have the whole closed loop control there. Now, some of the key results are that we're able to quantify the CPP CQA interactions. The data isn't just going to some historian. We're not operating on the assumption that we're going to have one set point always. We actually, the variability in control set points is actually valuable because it teaches us, we're able to learn how those outputs respond to changes in those control parameters, so that later on, if there's a process change, we know how to adjust our control parameters. And this as a learning the design space as well. So let's take a second here. A common question that we get here is, who owns the product knowledge? So Quartic is going to enable all this great quantification of your CPP CQA interactions, this optimization. I want to emphasize that Quartic is merely the tool that enables the optimization. So all intellectual property is owned by the manufacturer. Analogy here, think using Excel to fit a line of best fit. You've got some XY data, you fit a trend line to that, you leverage that in your day-to-day operation. You, the user, not Microsoft, own that resulting formula. So now let's take a look at how, I laid out the architecture of what we're deploying by integrating Quartic into our novel reactor system. Let's take a look at how we perhaps changed those QBD strategies that I introduced earlier. First aspect was process design and performance. I mentioned that the current method is statistical DOE. What we're running with the architecture that I described is an intelligent automated DOE recipe search guided by the PAT. And I'll go through in more detail what this explanation means. Next, we looked at product understanding. So I mentioned that currently the best way to gain this, in addition to what's done in the DOE, is tribal knowledge. You train an expert over a long period of time on a single process. Here, the product understanding is going to be inherent to that machine learning model, which is learning those relationships between CPPs and CQAs over every iteration that we test. So I mentioned we want to deploy this reactor in different areas, geographic zones. That machine learning model can be deployed in any of those zones, and already you have that product understanding inherent to this data system. Process controls. Currently, we look at a lot of inflexible SOPs. In the current framework, we have an optimization algorithm that determines the best control action based on that underlying machine learning model. So there's a process upset upstream. We can respond to that because we know that control space. And finally, we talked about continuous improvement, which right now, oftentimes it's business-driven initiatives. Here, we can take that bottom-up approach. We can continue to optimize during commercial manufacturing. So I mentioned in the previous step that this optimization algorithm is recommending control actions. That's not limited to the process design period. We can do this during commercial manufacturing so that we're not working with a golden with a static recipe. Now let's get into detail on each of these points. So the modern process design and performance. So I mentioned here what we're doing is we're going to explore the modern process design and performance. So the strategy that we use, and you can see this, I'll use the screenshot to explain this. This is directly from the application, which is controlling this novel reactor. So the user first defines the control space and characterizes the spectral fingerprint for product and impurities. So what I mean by that, you can see here for each of the set points, in this case, we've only configured 3, but these would be consider these the variables of your design of experiment. In this example, only 3, but we can consider however many control parameters there are in the process. The user simply has to define the range and an initial condition. So where are we going to start with when we begin this optimal exploration? And with regards to the IR spectra, so we read a target spectra. So this is the product that we're trying to manufacture. And we tell the system where is our production peak and where are any impurity peaks that we are looking to minimize. So when we, over each iteration, we compare the NIR spectra with this target to see, have we achieved, first, do we have a spectra that matches? And then we can ensure that we're making the right product. And then we can go and optimize further by maximizing the magnitude of that production peak and minimizing those impurity peaks. The next step of this, after this configuration, is for the user to specify the number of runs that they're going to, over which they're going to explore this control space. Now, they don't need you may think we're going to have many control parameters. You're going to need an exponential number of runs as you would with a statistical DOE. That's not the case here, and I'll get to that in some of the results. But over, as low as 5 to 10 runs, we can see improvements being made. And when we provide the algorithm the number of runs that we want to consider, we can actually tune how we're exploring the control space versus exploiting a region that we know is good and trying to maximize that even further. Next, over this iteration, I mentioned we're going to identify a set point that matches the spectral fingerprint. And then afterwards, we would optimize the purity and impurity peaks by iterating over the control space. Let's look at how we build modern process understanding. So as I mentioned, with every iteration, we are collecting the values of the CPPs and CQAs, and we're feeding those into a machine learning model where we're predicting the impact between those inputs and outputs. So that surrogate process model, it contains the process understanding and it's updated with every run. And you can see what types of insights we can get from this. We can get a feature importance where we see every parameter that it has an impact on the output. We can see the performance of this. So we are able to achieve, we can see the performance of these models, and then we can actually do predictions. So see if we, by defining values for any of these control parameters, what is the predicted output going to be? And finally, we look at what modern process controls and continuous improvement look like. So as I've mentioned before, we have that surrogate process model and we layer the risk-based optimization on top to determine the best set points. And we continue exploring during manufacturing to respond to process outputs. So what you can see here is the dimensionality of the set point has been reduced to 1. So this could be, the set point could consist of many control parameters. But for each iteration, for example, you can essentially build this is an idea of how we learn that control space. So the black dots are the set points that we've tested, and those other areas of the curve, those where we have a shaded region, that's our confidence region. So there's some uncertainty there. So we take a risk-based approach to explore those regions over the iterations to find where is our best operating condition. And we can continue to do this beyond process design. So during commercial manufacturing, we can, the user could perhaps simply reduce the amount of exploration to minimize any risk that they do see. And what types of results have we seen with this? So for this example, the novel reactor, where we have this, we're trying to make these APIs. The challenges I laid out were really to do this, get to market in an efficient manner, and ensure that we're operating in an optimal manner so that this is competitive compared to existing strategies. The application that we're using here is really that automated DOE that I took you through, and this is just one part of the core of this modern data analytics platform. And what we find is that there's a significant time reduction in time required to optimize the recipes, and we can achieve that closed loop, continuous and autonomous biomanufacturing. And in fact, by the estimate in time reduction by the CTO at this manufacturer was a 434% time reduction as compared to using the traditional QBD strategies. So somewhat in a different industry, in the food and beverage industry, we've applied a similar methodology. This is now offline, so it's not continuous closed loop, but it's the same optimization algorithm. And this is now for a batch process, not a continuous process. So you can see we have the idea here is we need to optimize some parameter, and we need to learn that control space in the same manner. So we do this using completely offline with CSV data uploads. The user gets a recommendation for the set point that will meet the objective. They take that back to the process. The results are then uploaded back into the system to learn that control space. And through a proof of concept on actually commercial beer fermentation batches, we used only 30 batches of historical data, and a pilot on 20% of batches over 3 months yielded the following results. So the objectives were to address process performance and consistency and respond to process upsets that are regularly occurring. So they didn't want a static recipe. They wanted to be flexible to upstream fluctuation. We did this offline set point recommendation. And in the end, we were able to improve yield by 20%, reduce variability by 49%. And actually, there was a side benefit of also reducing the cycle time by approximately 15%. So with that, I'd like to conclude this presentation. And if there are any questions, I can take them now.